All right, there we go. Everything is now, I think, working. Say hello, James.
Hello. I hope you can all hear me because earlier we were having some audio problems too. It's just, like you said, one of those days.
Yeah.
How you doing, Ted? What's new with you?
So this is something that I've been looking at for a little while, and it's come up in my community, is event sourcing, and in more general event-driven development. And because in the ensembles that I run, one of the things we're doing in the learning ensembles is where we've been just continually building on this blackjack game that I use in my course. And we're at the point where, among other things, we're going to be doing some persistence. And a suggestion came up, it's like, hey, let's do this as event sourcing. And it's been a while since I really dug into it, and so I recently dug back into it. Redug. But anyway, look back into it, and I'm like, oh wow, this is actually quite a bit different. But in terms, this is not something we're going to be able to say, oh, let's just change a class or two. It's like it's really a fundamental shift in the way that you honestly think about storing state. And I was looking at a book that was using a framework called Axon IQ to do some of this stuff, and event sourcing and event driven. And I don't know. It's like it's pretty heavy on annotations, and because if you didn't have annotations, then it'd be pretty heavy on listeners. And so I'm curious I've gotten certain thoughts about it, but I'm curious. Do you have experience? Have you worked in systems that are sort of event-driven, event sourcing or not, but sort of more heavily event-driven?
I have worked in systems that were heavily event-driven, not so much event sourcing. Although I have to say, I have not dug into that recently. I did. So for the Agile Fluency project, we had this Agile Fluency diagnostic, and one of our facilitators built an online Agile Fluency diagnostic, and they did it with event sourcing.
Oh, interesting.
But so I know they were really into that style, and my understanding is it comes out of the domain-driven design community.
Yes, I mean I would say it's sort of it comes from that. Well, I think it's more associated with CQRS, the CQRS architecture. In fact, a lot of people think that if you're doing CQRS, you must do event sourcing, and it's not quite that. And you can do event sourcing without CQRS, but they're usually associated.
I've looked into event sourcing. I've looked into CQRS. I haven't. Hey, Endofunctor, that's a great question. Let's make sure to come back to that, Ted. I have not actually tried to do it myself, but I've had some skepticism about it. And so every time it comes up, I listen to what people say about it. And at least as of a couple of years ago, what I was hearing from people was that it sounds really good, but when you get into it, it's quite, it's. I don't know if I'm even talking about the same thing, but what I was seeing was this idea of sort of this immutable event-based database approach,
right,
where all of your current data is calculated from the stream of events that's come in over history.
Right.
Is that's still what people are talking about?
Yeah. So that's exactly event sourcing. So instead of saying, here's the state of this order and it's got 5 products in it, and we just store it, and all you know about is before there was no order, and now there is an order with 5 items in it. The event sourcing is saying, well, how did that get built? It's because somebody added a product, then removed the product, then changed the quantity on a product, and they added a product, and then added another product, and then removed a product. And so there was these series of 10 events that ended up with a cart or order that had 5 items in it. And so in order to rebuild that state, you basically replay those events.
Right. And of course, you have to have some sort of caching, because you can't do that for the things that are frequently accessed because it's too heavyweight.
Yeah, and that's where there's all sorts of snapshots and projections and all sorts of things to optimize that. Although, to be quite honest, unless you've got a tremendous number of events, it's actually not that expensive, because the bulk reads from the database are really, really fast. But you can certainly optimize it. And for things like an order, you don't expect there to be 10,000 events on it. So you're not replaying that many.
Yeah, I mean, when I first heard about it, my thought was, well, this makes a lot of sense. because history is important, and knowing what has happened. Databases are often sort of a snapshot in time,
Right.
and it is what it is now. But
Yeah.
what was it
What was
yesterday?
it? Yeah. How did it
Don't
get
know.
here? It's wrong.
Yeah.
How did it get wrong? Yeah.
And then, of course, you often need audit logs. And so
Right.
event sourcing gives you audit logs for free,
Right.
and it's immutable. And yes, you can sort of put in like keyframes or snapshots where you don't have to go back to the very beginning of time. My first reaction to it, though, is that programmers love building complicated things. And they will go to great lengths to avoid doing the stuff that brings business value by building more complicated things. That's a little
Yes.
bit uncharitable of me. But,
Seriously.
given the choice between building yet another CRUD app and building an event-sourced app, I know what I would choose.
Right. Of course.
But that doesn't mean that that's what's best for the organization.
Right. Right.
So color me skeptical. I want to know exactly what are the use cases that benefit from this complexity. Because if you're talking about having to have your calls to the database now sort of aggregate this stream of events, that's a lot more complicated than just doing a query.
Yeah.
And yes, you can use a framework, but now you're going to have all the costs of a framework that are going to be around what are our leaky abstraction. And one of those leaky abstraction things might be performance, or might be it's not easy to just join things together anymore. So I've not done it myself, but if somebody said to me, hey, I really want to use event sourcing, I would say, what problem are you solving?
Yeah.
And why, why is event sourcing the right solution?
Exactly. Yeah, because you buy into it, like Axon.IQ looks really nice. I've looked at it on and off over the years and gone through some of their docs and it looks nice for what it has, but again it's like it's a framework. You're bought in or you're not, and if you buy in, do you have to buy in everywhere, and how much do you have to buy in, and how much does it basically does it cost you in terms of that complexity, as well as just trying to understand it. And this is where so I 100% agree. Like, why do you actually need these events?
And the audit log problem is a solved problem. So if that's the only use case, then it's not worth it.
Right. If it's just an audit log, that's easy. Don't make your what's basically your CRUD part more complicated, just because you can absolutely solve that in many other easy and more or less invasive ways, which I think is one of the key things. Yeah. But what it does is and I see people talk about it, and it feels a lot like microservices. Like, here's a solution looking for a problem. And again, I think if you really do have that need, and like you said, if business can say this is what we need, and the complexity matches the value that it's providing, then absolutely, it's very elegant, it's very nice. There's a lot of well-known ways to deal with things like, well, what happens if the thing that's holding the state, it changes, right? Versioning, so you're versioning your streams and things like that. And for just event sourcing, I think that's okay, because it is also, you can, assuming you're not using an all-invasive framework, you can sort of localize it to the object, but it is fairly leaky. And so Endfunctions just says, why does every aggregate need to be event sourced? And I think it's like, well, what if you have one aggregate, right, a group of objects that's managing the state, if you convert that to event sourced and other ones are not, I don't know. Now you've got different, like, what was the reason for doing one versus the other, and are they consistent? And so consistency is also, I think, important. And so it feels like you just have to buy in completely, otherwise I don't see how you'd manage it. And so there's that part where it's like, it feels like once you buy in, you really do need to buy in for all your state.
Kent Beck talks about reversibility of decisions. When I had him on my book club, we talked about evolutionary design, and he talked about making decision reversible. And I think this is one of his hidden gems, which is that we want, as designers, we know we're not perfect, and that the domain is going to change, and then our needs are going to change, and our ability is going to change.
Right.
And so I've learned through decades of being hit on the head by the computer, being told, no, that doesn't work. I've learned a certain amount of humility. And one of the things that I've learned is that everything I know is wrong. I just don't know how it's wrong.
Right.
So I'm not willing to say event sourcing is wrong. For example, that these folks who did the online Agile Fluency diagnostic, they're ex-peers. Like, they understand simplicity. I trust their judgment, and they chose to use it. So there's definitely something to this. What I want to know is, if I choose to go with event sourcing, if I decide that was a bad decision, how screwed am I?
Right. How hard is it to undo? Yeah.
How reversible is that decision?
Yeah.
I want my decisions to be as reversible as possible.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm always looking for really small, simple solutions.
Right. And I think for event sourcing, so unit test case asks the difference between event sourcing and event driven. So I'm going to take a moment and define that, because to me, I look at event driven as like this big umbrella. Like, basically, if you are, instead of directly invoking methods, you're broadcasting events in some way, maybe using an event bus that's internal. Maybe you're sending it to an external queue or a broker or something like that. But the idea is it's basically a level of indirection, and so you're only doing things as responding to events. Event sourcing is specifically about how do we persist our information. So the example like before, it's like, I've got an order. Well, how did that order get created? You either just see it's what it is now, and you didn't see anything. So it's basically sort of the data at rest versus all the things that happen to create it. So event sourcing does use events to basically replay and to load them into memory and to generate them and save them out. So you're saving out those individual events. But it does mean that your code is more complex in some way, because you're having to deal with now this extra moving part, which are these events. It's not just store a new number in a field. It's now you have to record an entire event, and as well, you also have sort of the current state of the thing. And so event driven then is sort of the larger thing. Is like, well, if you do that, you're probably going to have a lot more event driven kind of code. And that's where I don't know, like, some people have said, hey, we've been doing event driven stuff and it works really well. But it definitely is a shift in sort of thinking. And also, I don't know, maybe I'm old school. I like being able to see what method calls of what.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that I have a fair amount of experience with event driven systems, and they're a very seductive idea. But the reality of a complex event-driven system is that, there's this, I think I've mentioned this before, there's this old joke programming language called Intercal. And Intercal is making fun of various things. You see these joke programming languages every now and then. Of course, this comes from is a very old joke language. And so instead of having go to, they have come from, which is, you don't say where the code's going to go next. You just say that, magically the code starts here at this line whenever it hits, this number. So you say come from line 30. Whenever the execution hits line 30, it goes to the come from line. That's what events are like.
Yes.
They're come froms.
Yes.
It's extremely hard to know where they come from. Like, when does that happen? How does that happen? It's spooky action at a distance.
Yeah.
And when you combine that with an event bus or message bus, and perhaps this event sourcing, and you've got all these events flying around, it starts becoming extraordinarily difficult to predict what's going to happen at any given moment.
Yeah.
So I think there's a place for events. We're going to be probably doing some event stuff today as we get into the output tracking for our fetch wrapper. Obviously, last time as we were doing all the servers HTTP server stuff, that's all built around events.
Right.
There is absolutely a place for events, but the further the distance between the thing that creates the event and the thing that listens for the event, the harder it is to make any predictions about how your code's going to behave.
Yeah.
And so I don't like events as a large scale control flow mechanism.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like them on the really small scale for stuff like the way Node does it, where you subscribe to the event and you see where the event's coming from, and you have the event handler right next to each other in the same file. But when they're across multiple files, that's a big problem.
Yeah. So Suiji mentions tooling, and I already, when you were saying, sort of spooky action at a distance or sort of magic, and immediately what came to mind is, besides events, is aspect-oriented programming. Mm-hmm. Right? Back in the early 2000s, I think aspects were huge. There's Aspect-J, and even some of the IDEs tried to implement some of that. But again, it was
that's where these attribute tags sort of came out of that fad.
Yeah. And
code weaving.
And so it's basically like, well, for any method that has this parameter or that has this name, do this first and then do this after. And I think it's one of those, I think it's a great idea in certain limited cases. Like if you're doing things like logging or security or like these, what they called cross-cutting concerns, right? And that's where all these, the language of point cuts and things came in. And the tooling tried to help, but I think it's interesting. I think it was too early because the IDEs were just not powerful enough. And I think if it was introduced today, sort of tool first, maybe it would work better. But it's still hard because, and this is where, like, you see these visual languages. It's like, oh, let's do visual languages. Like, yes, those work for toy examples. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, text works really well.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's how I feel about tooling. If your idea doesn't work well without tool support, I'm super skeptical about it.
Yeah.
Like, I love tooling to make code easier to work with. But you've seen the way I work. Like, I'm old school. I'm going to run Git on the command line. I'm not going to use the tool. And that's partly because the nature of the work I do is I'm switching around between tools. Right. I can't count on the tool working the way I want it to all the time. I need the basics to work.
Yeah.
But yeah, any design idea that doesn't work well in text, to me, that's a major strike against it just before we even get off the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's not just the tools that sort of are in front of us. There are also the tools that are on, like, the GitLab or the GitHub. Is like the pull request. Like, as much as I hate pull requests, the fact is they're a fact of life. And how would you evaluate that if, like, it's bad enough that the tooling there still is kind of meh. But imagine, like, now, stuff is being changed. And so you see one file that's changed when really it's affecting 10 different pieces of behavior.
Yeah. How do you, again, events on the small scale aren't the problem. It's when you have events crossing teams. Now you've got a major problem. Or even if you've got, a large monolith, and and this part of the application is now affecting this part of the application, basically violates cohesion, which is that when we change something, we want to be able to understand what that change affects. And part of the idea of having cohesive code is we put the things that change together physically close together.
Right. Yeah, and so Antifunctor Zero says about using internal events to communicate between different modules. And
well, exactly. I think that's what I was just getting at.
Yeah,
I think that can be really problematic because
I really, because on the other hand, like, there is this idea of sort of independence, and I think this is where some people, I think, recognize that, look, I don't care who handles this event. Somebody's going to handle it, and I don't care who. And then there's some code that does, and so that's nice because it's this decoupling or this perceived decoupling.
Until you need to refactor.
And so that's where it all comes back to me for, is like all these things, like, how do I refactor this? Because I think, like, like you were saying, it's like we evolve our designs, we don't know stuff now, and so I think, so it's interesting. So it always seems to come back to refactoring. Like, how how do I refactor this?
And we can't just say don't refactor, because
No.
therein lies madness. I mean, the reason that the only way it's possible for a code base to live long term is if you correct the design over time.
Right.
And by correct, I think it's the height of hubris to think that you can design something correctly the first time.
Yeah.
But even if you could design it perfectly the first time, as your needs change, the right design changes. So it's not, even the perfect design of 5 years ago is not the perfect design of today.
Exactly, because it may not be any of your needs. It may be the fact that the rest of the world has changed, and you're sitting there like you still have to live in that world, which means you have to call and receive APIs, and you have to run on machines that may not have existed 5 years ago and run in situations. Yeah. So the fact is I always sometimes think about it as like, if nothing else, you're on a moving treadmill.
Yeah.
And you got to keep moving, otherwise you will fall off.
I know. I think there is a place for message buses and event buses and something like that, but you need to be really careful about how you use them. I see it's so tempting, I think, for people to just spam events onto a message bus that go out into the ether, and then they are stuck. They have to continue to spam that event with that exact same semantics forever, because if they change it, they're going to break somebody, and they don't know who. I'm assuming a large enterprise situation where you've got dozens of teams, and there's no way to, one of those.
Yeah, and this is where you have a book. So Greg Young is one of the well-known people in the CQRS area, and also writes about obviously event sourcing. And he wrote basically a book on versioning your event streams. And it's you can do it. And yes, there are good ways to do it. But
keep that as small as possible. Like there are situations where it does not make sense to do polling, where you actually have to be interrupt driven. You have to be informed when something happens rather than asking at the moment. I think those situations are fewer than people think they are. I think you can design your code so that it's not so bad to just go ask when you need to know a piece of information. But sometimes you do need to be informed this thing is happening. But keep those to an absolute minimum and treat them as debt. Like before you make that decision, say, do we really, really need this? I think when you put in a sort of a message bus as a default, it becomes really easy to just toss everything on the bus. And that's where the problems come from. Yeah. Not the fact that you have events, but the fact that you have indiscriminate events.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I could be wrong, Maybe I am.
It's one of those. That's my gut feel. Yeah, it's one of those where I always question myself: is it just because I'm old, and like sort of stuck in my ways in the sense of I've been doing this for so long. But yeah, I think about the testing and actually Axon's IQ's testing. It looks really nice. You basically say if I emit these events, then this, and I do this, and then this should happen, and this should be the event that we get. It's like, oh, that's pretty nice. Like that's it's almost output tracker, like that's the kind of but I haven't seen it work well in large scale, long lived applications, and that's where I just don't know. And so
I want to see there is something related to event sourcing that I really like the idea of, and this is from the domain-driven design crowd, and that is event storming. Have you seen this?
Yes, yeah. So event storming, event modeling. I love event storming. Yeah, I've done it a few times, and it's so beautiful. And I think you had talked about on Brian Merrick's podcast. What is it? Boundary.
Something. Boundary objects.
Boundary objects, yeah. And so that's very much where it's like you're basically, and I don't know too much about it, but correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what event storming feels like, is you're building this piece of information that's crossing sort of business and technical domain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to bring people up to speed, a boundary object is just some sort of physicalized representation. It may be, on a remote, some sort of computer thing, so it may not be literally physical, but it's a representation of what everybody is thinking, and it's a way of getting people on the same page by making their thoughts concrete and make it a diagram. And so event storming, which I'll let you describe, Ted, is going to create one of these boundary objects.
And so the thing I like about it is you you almost can't screw it up to a certain extent. If you get the right people in the room and you start talking through, and it's like, let's walk through some scenarios. Like, what do we want done? Okay, so we want somebody to buy a ticket to a concert. Okay, so they do this and they do this, and is that right? Well, no, this other thing has to happen here. Okay, well, where does that happen? Who does that? Which part? What do we want to be responsible? Oh, wait, but actually there's some, right? And it basically draws out all these things that, especially, this is where the business person knows it. And it's so natural and intrinsic to what they do. They don't even think about it. And
where how do we hear about this? Who tells us this?
Right.
What happens next?
Right.
Yeah, it's similar to story mapping in a way.
Yeah. And
I've not yet had a chance to do event storming. I really would like to, though, because I think it's really solid. And then I think the attraction of event sourcing, and maybe these things didn't come in this order, but I think event storming turns into sort of a ubiquitous language implementation with event sourcing. I just worry that and then that, of course, leads to an implementation that involves probably a message bus and lots of events. And I really like the event storming, but I'm not sure that the complexity costs of the rest of it are worth it. And when I say I'm not sure, I literally mean I'm not sure. I don't know. Yeah. But I would check into it before I committed to that route.
Yeah, I think sending events out, if the sort of the way I feel about sort of sending events out and saying, handle it or not, versus explicitly sort of calling what's essentially a remote procedure call. I think for me, remote procedure call is like, does that really need to be a separate system? I feel like if they're going to be independent, right, they're independently deployable, independently developed, I think events can work really well in that context, because you can sort of add on a new one that's now listening for stuff, and the sender doesn't have to know explicitly about it at all. Right. So I think there's power in there, but of course you still have to make sure everybody's on the same page, and you have to migrate your events appropriately, and define them. But if you've used a thing like event storming, it can make some of that really clear. But
I think a lot of this comes back to, and I know I've talked about this before, I think a lot of this comes back to the original sin of large-scale software systems, which is that small teams are actually not a great idea. Like microservices, I think to a degree, event sourcing, these are all come out of the idea that we want to have autonomous teams of maybe 3 or 4 or 5 programmers.
Right.
And if we could actually just have more people working together, a lot of these workarounds for the fact that we do want autonomous teams, but having so many autonomous teams is just really hard to coordinate.
Yes, it's the coordination.
And what you can do is you can push the coordination problems out of the team to a higher level, and that feels at the team level like we've solved the problem. But it's actually just made the real problem of now how do we coordinate all these things happening between all these teams. It's made it more diffuse and thus worse and harder to deal with.
Right. So
yes, it's hard to coordinate 20 people. And that's where stuff like FAST comes in. And so 4 independent 5-person teams feels better to the people on those teams, but it does not actually work better from a whole system perspective.
Yeah. So Suiju asks, is refactoring really easier with published APIs versus published events? I
think that's a great question.
I would say I think it's easier to migrate. You basically say, if I go back and forth about, how do you version APIs and so on, but it's easier to say, well, if you want this stuff, call this other endpoint. And so you've segregated. You could sort of do the same thing with, I don't know how you do that with messages unless you have somebody that's translating those messages. So I think you can have sort of, not that I think you want to have necessarily lots of different versions of an API around, but I think you can migrate more easily from one version to another than sort of migrating events. But again, it's one of those, I don't have enough experience in doing it. So
I think it is a really good point. Anytime you publish an API, you are committing yourself to that. You're making refactoring difficult, which is one of the reasons we want to avoid publishing. And having a nice system like Google has, where you can, using something like Bazel, where we say, I'm going to change this and run the test of everybody who depends
Right.
on this. There's a lot of benefits to that. And using something like a disciplined approach to contract testing can help with that as well.
Yeah.
Now, can that same approach solve the problems with event sourcing that we're talking about? To me, it just feels harder, and maybe that for me is unfamiliarity. Maybe it's not as bad as I think.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I think the event sourcing is pretty well isolated. It's sort of the events, these which comes from or at least certainly pushed by domain-driven design, although really goes back. So Gregor Hope was way before his time with the Enterprise Integration Patterns book. I remember reading it, and he was at the Silicon Valley Design Patterns group where we even reviewed some of it. This was like, 2000, early 2000s, and it was like, now it's really like coming to its own, because now it's like we have all these messaging systems that are interacting. But that's where I just don't have enough experience of implementing these on a large enough scale to know, how well that works. So
Suiji makes a really good point in the chat, which is that with an event, you're really throwing it out into the ether.
Right.
If you have an API, you can do things with that API that control how people interact with it. First, you can just log who's interacting with you.
Right.
Where's this coming from? And then you can go talk to those people. Whereas an event, you have no way of knowing who's using the event.
Right.
You can also do things like start to throttle it, or, I think you have more control when somebody is calling you versus when you're just throwing something out into the world.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is and the other thing that has come into, and maybe this is more of the tooling thing, is the whole observability in production, and seeing how, and these ways of seeing how the events are sort of moving throughout the system. Mm-hmm. And that can probably help, but again, that's an area I just don't have enough experience in.
Yeah. Well, should we do some work on our fetch wrapper?
Yes, I did want to go back.
That's right. Early on, we had a comment
about suffixing application services with service.
Right.
So how do you feel about suffixes?
I use the suffix client whenever I've got a wrapper for for an external service, which is basically, and if somebody were to call that service rather than client, I'd be okay with that. And I know you don't love these suffixes, so we might have a difference of opinion on this. But the reason I do that, the reason I think it's important, is because I don't want my abstraction to leak. When I'm talking to the outside world, that matters. Mm-hmm. And I want that to be obvious from the name that I'm talking to the outside world. Now, if we're talking about the service pattern, which is not about talking to external services, but it's just sort of this brain dead way of grouping functions together rather than doing object-oriented programming, I hate that. Not only don't call it service, just don't do that at all.
Yeah.
But if we're actually talking to the outside world, then I'll put client or service on it.
Yeah. So I have some standard suffixes I use for, like we've already talked about, for DTOs and what role do they play, and I think that's really useful. But I think sort of the last thing you mentioned, sort of the application service layer and tacking service onto stuff. I do it in some cases, sort of depending on my audience, but I don't like it because really after a while I feel like these are often commands or queries, and sometimes I just want those commands and queries to stand on their own. Like, what are you doing? This is some kind of player command. Does it need to, and this is where you get into some of the cohesion stuff. It's like, do I want individual small grain commands, or do I want to group up these commands together because they operate on very similar things that I'd almost prefer it to be like, player commands instead of player service, to sort of show sort of what it's doing. But I will name it service sometimes, just because for those who are new, it can make it very clear. Okay, this is that part of the layering, but in general, I really don't like those, because it just feels like it adds no information.
Right.
Doesn't tell you anything more. Like, you could look at the package and already see what layer it's in. It says it's application, so of course, what else is it going to be?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then you get into the customer manager facade singleton service.
Yeah. I'm old school object oriented design guy. Like I was into objects way back in the day, and I still like my objects to be a representation of something, to be a noun that means something, and that is basically responsible for everything related to that thing.
Right.
So, what is a service? And if we're not talking about an external service, what is a service? What is it's not a meaningful word.
Yeah. It's like game service. Like, okay, great. What does that mean?
Yeah. If it represents the game, have it represent the game.
Right. And if it's in the application layer, well, it's like, what is it doing? So Suiji mentions to Alistair Coburn as a naming convention that he and I don't think he developed it by himself. I think he and some other folks did it, where you basically say, sort of prefix it with the word for and add a verb. So it's like, this is for persisting or for sending, something like that. And I don't know. I there's a little bit of an appeal to me, but I feel like I've looked at it and I've looked at a bunch of examples, and I probably have to try it out more, but it doesn't yet click for me. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of ports in general. Like I like things that are super concrete, and with Nullables, you don't end up with multiple implementations, right? So there's no need to have an interface that would be the port. You just have the adapter.
Right.
And I think over abstraction is one of the common errors programmers make. Don't, if we've got an air conditioning unit, don't call it the cool evaporator. Call it an air conditioning unit.
Right.
Don't call it the people cooler or the temperature lower or anything like that. This is the air conditioning unit. Everybody knows what an air conditioning unit is.
And if you don't, then you should learn that in your domain and put that in your ubiquitous language dictionary so that everybody knows what that means.
Call things what they are. Don't introduce abstractions until you have multiple things. And multiple, and tests don't count as multiple things. They're something that you build just for a test. And again, using Nullables, you don't have to do that. But if I've got a real thing and a fake thing that I do in my test, or a mock thing, that doesn't count as multiple implementations in my mind.
In your mind.
In my mind, yeah. Because the test code is noise. I think tests are really important, but they are not part of the design, and I want to minimize the amount of test code that I have. Now, obviously, I don't do that entirely, because Nullables, I'm putting stuff in production, so I'm not 100% successful on that. But I see that as a flaw, not as a benefit.
Yeah, I generally agree. Like trying to come up with the abstraction first is, I don't know. It's just really hard for me to do that. What is, I basically have to think of what are the concrete ones that I want to abstract over, and it's like, if there's one, then it's really hard to abstract over one, and so then you're just making stuff up.
Wheatlaw says, "What would you call a mail service?" And I actually can answer this question because that has come up. I call it a SendGrid client, because the service I'm using is SendGrid, and I'm making a client for SendGrid. And if I want to make a client for something else, let's call it, what's one of the other ones?
Mailgun.
Or something. What'd you say?
Mailgun.
Yeah. Then I call that Mailgun client, because you know what? The implementation of SendGrid client and Mailgun client are going to be really different. Now, if I have a, presumably, I have not actually implemented Mailgun, but if I've got a code base that actually uses both SendGrid and Mailgun, maybe as a backup for each other, then I would have a email client.
Right. Exactly. Yep.
And but when you look at the implementation of email client, it's going to say SendGrid client, and it's going to say Mailgun client, and it's going to use the one. It's going to have the logic that chooses between them.
Right.
But I wouldn't make an email client if I didn't have that. I would just use SendGrid client.
Yeah.
And part of that is because if I need to rename that in the future, I just rename it.
Right. Yeah. And it's also, and I agree. And so like the way I think about, reason I sort of like the, some of the adapter stuff is, or the way I implement some of the adapter stuff, which I think is different than what I've seen other people do with hexagonal, is create that separation. It's like, there's the part where I'm basically saying, well, what information am I going to email? Maybe I want to nicely format that, but it's going to be the same content, right? The same body, regardless of email service. So there's stuff that's independent of the concrete service that I'm using, right? And where do I get the email address from? What's the subject going to be? What's the format, the text version and the HTML version? And then there's, well, this API says I have to package it up this way in these objects, and this service says I have to package it up this other way in these other objects. And then there's this third service where there is no SDK, so I have to put it into JSON myself. So there's sort of the edge, the technical stuff, and then there's the more general stuff that can be shared. But you don't have to use adapters for that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if I actually had a Mailgun service and a SendGrid service, then the API that the application code is going to call probably would be the same. And I might introduce an interface at that point. But honestly, I'm more likely to introduce like an email client that abstracts the decision, because somebody's got to make a decision about which one do we call.
Right.
And so rather than just using an interface and pushing that decision up into the code, I would make a higher level wrapper to make that decision for me, and have that decision nicely encapsulated and in one spot.
So there was a question about, hey, 3 Machinists, thoughts on upcoming Java v21. I'm really looking forward to Java version 21. There's some good stuff coming. If nothing else, the Loom sort of virtual thread stuff, but also there's just a bunch of preview stuff and finalized stuff, and so I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, and of course the thing I heard about is that you don't need public static void main anymore.
I mean, that's great. I mean, absolutely. I fully support making it easier for those who are trying to get us started with Java to not have to write all this boilerplate. But it is, I'm amused because it's one of those, it gets a lot of attention, and I think that's great, but it's also not terribly significant for lots of folks. But hey, anything that gets more people to use Java, I'm in favor of.
I haven't looked into it because I haven't been keeping up with Java lately. But for years, I've not been keeping up with Java. Although I still, that's where I did the majority of my programming when I first started out. So I still have a soft spot for it, and I try to pay somewhat attention to it. But basically, they're introducing the idea of modules. They're going to have anonymous classes, right, where everything is effectively a static function on an unnamed class. Is that what's going on?
I honestly haven't looked at the technical underpinnings of it. All I saw was you don't need the class surrounding it, and yeah, presumably it's doing something interesting underneath. But I haven't looked at the details.
I do actually think, like, working in JavaScript took me a little while to sort of get out of that Java and C# mentality where everything has got to be a class. But there are some times when I've just got a bag of functions, I want to put them in a namespace, and there's no state. And so it's nice to just have, this is my collection of functions. Yeah. And if you don't have to put a class around that, I think there's some benefit to that. It depends on how they've implemented it, though.
Yeah, I'll probably look at how once 21 comes closer, so it comes out in September. So probably sometime in August, I'll start looking deep into it. And yes, Loom is definitely in release 21.
Yeah. Ruslik had a question about the email client, saying instead of starting with email client, you just use SendGrid client, and that you care about and refactor it later. Exactly. Yeah. I design my code with the assumption that it will be refactored. So let's go with what's simple, and because modern tooling makes refactoring really easy, even in a language like JavaScript.
Yeah.
But also good well-designed code, if you make a change to something, you shouldn't see that like splattering out and affecting the entire code base. If it does, that's a problem.
If it does, that tells you something.
Yeah. So it's not a big deal to refactor. If I made a SendGrid client and then later on I needed, some other client doing something else, I actually did this like in my screencast, my JavaScript screencast, which was had a subscription website. My authentication provider in the beginning was Persona, which nobody's probably heard of because it's a Mozilla thing that didn't get much acceptance. And they end-of-lifed it on me. Well, the last thing I want to be doing is replacing my authentication service, but I had to.
Yeah.
And of course, before I had a Persona client, and I had to add an Auth0 client, and these things were nothing alike.
Right.
So I just made a new Auth0 client that lived alongside my Persona client. I used a feature flag to determine which one was used. And then eventually, after I had everything migrated over to use the Auth0 client, I deleted the Persona client. But at no point was there a login service or a login client. There was Persona and there was Auth0, and they were very different, and that distinction mattered. So an abstraction would have been a bad thing because it would have abstracted something that's not actually abstractable.
There's some things, especially like authors, that like abstractions, like Spring Security, right? So it's really hard to understand because there's all these. I think part of it is because there are all these abstractions, and it's necessary for a framework like that to have those. But it really does, like, you start getting a bit lost and like, wait, who's doing what? Like, it's trying to talk it's like trying to talk to somebody using very generic terms. It's like, well, what do you mean by that? Can you give me an example of that? Like, and this is very much like against how we learn. Right? I always go back to how we learn is we don't learn from abstractions. We learn from abstracting over time in our head, constructing abstractions based on being shown lots of examples, right? Is this a cat or not? This is a cat. Is this a cat? No, that's a lion. And the more examples you see, the more you start building the abstraction in your head. Now, that abstraction may not match somebody else's who has more expert knowledge of how to, well, that's this kind of cat. This other kind of feline, right? It's like, okay, but is it a cat or not?
Yeah. And then, that's where boundary objects come in to sort of bridge those differences of understanding.
Yeah.
But I think that it's I think a really common mistake for the 5 to 10 years of experienced programmers to try to build super abstractions. And I just want to push people into, no, just call it what it is. Use it. So, be concrete. Be super concrete.
Yeah. So Bruce brought up the database one, and I'm like, okay, there's some things that can abstract over it, like JP, but really don't. Like, why would you need to abstract over multiple databases? Yes, there's some cases where you're going to need to be able to support multiple databases. I worked on a project where we had to support basically the three different databases: Oracle, MS SQL Server, and for some reason DB2, because IBM paid us even though no customer ever used it. But that was horrible. And in general, you know what you're deploying against. And so just program directly to it. Create the schema directly for Postgres. Create your whatever is directly for Postgres. Like, the idea that you're going to replace one with another, like, when you replace it, you'll figure it out, and the abstraction will just get in the way.
Yeah. It doesn't happen that often. And to really prevent yourself from ending up with anything vendor specific, including some of the performance characteristics, you have to be deploying against multiple databases from the beginning, and that cost is probably not really worth it.
Yeah.
And not only just deploying, but running in production, because
they have different. Especially in high volume, high performance, you're actually going to want to know what those little differences are in how, does this lock stuff when you do this thing? Does this, freeze the entire table when you do this other thing? Do you have to run garbage collection like there's so many differences to the way these are implemented that, sure, if you're not holding a lot of information, then it's probably fine to abstract. But when you're really trying to get to some performance stuff, you're going to want to know the specialty that this database has in terms of this specific scenario.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Now, Astrid, you talked about people learn by seeing concrete examples and then creating abstractions from that. Astrid makes a really good point that some people want to know, well, tell me how this all works so that I can put my examples into that framework. I think that makes a lot of sense. People do have different learning styles.
Well, so there's some people who want to know, how does this fit together, and what are the relationships, and so connect it with prior knowledge. But study after study shows that the way we learn, I mean, it depends on what you want to learn, is we learn from the concrete examples. You can introduce the abstraction and say, okay, now you've seen 3 examples. Let's talk about what the commonalities of these are. But starting out totally abstract just doesn't work unless you've already got some of that knowledge. And so I don't think inductive or deductive is really relevant to sort of the learning. That's more of I think a problem solving related idea. I think having the abstraction first, it may feel that. So one of the problems with learn, and then I'll go off this topic, is learners do not know what's best for them. It's study. I was just reading a more recent, just yet another study of, it felt really good. I feel like I really know it, but the test scores and knowledge assessments prove that no, you didn't know it any better than these other people who thought this was horrible, and I learned nothing. And so the fact is what's called judgment of learning. We are very poor. We don't measure. We don't understand what causes us to actually learn well, and that's just unfortunate, because it means we do things that aren't actually the best way to learn. Because oh, that felt good, and I feel like I know it, when actually you don't.
Well, I think it's time for our first break. We've managed to waste an entire hour.
All right. That might be a record for us.
It might be a record. I mean, last time we got pretty close, but we made a general vague gesture in the direction of doing programming before the hour was up. Yeah. This time, I don't think we even got that far. Yeah. So I think it's been a really interesting conversation, though. So thanks. And I love all the participation.
Yeah.
So let's take our break. I need to do a little bit of stretching, and then we'll come back and maybe do some programming.
I think we should actually do some programming. I think that would be a great idea.
Right. That's what.
Because otherwise, Otherwise, I could talk about some of this stuff forever. But I think we really would like to make some progress. So, all right, we'll take a break, and then we'll write some code.
All right. See you in a few.
All right, we're back.
Okay, let's do some coding.
All right.
Okay, so when we left off, we were working on our fetch wrapper on the front end. And where was that? It was here. HttpClient is what we were working on.
Mm-hmm.
Let me go ahead and run our tests.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what we were doing was we had written a focused integration test that started up a SpyServer and then told the server what response we expected to send back. And then we used fetch to make a request to that server. And then we tested that it worked the way that we thought it did. And that was pretty much done. Like we actually, the point here, of course, is to make a little wrapper of the browser's fetch global, which does HTTP requests so that we can talk to our backend and talk to OpenAI and do our ChatGPT-like stuff. So the question is where do we want to go? Where do we want to go next on this? And I see Astrid just put in a whole bunch of stuff responding to what you said about learning. So
yeah,
I kind of wonder if we should.
I'm going to say, Astrid, I'd love to talk about that, but let's find another venue to do that, because I if it were just me, we would totally take the next hour and talk about that.
One thing I've learned about.
The reason why
One thing
is
I've
like
learned
I've
about you, Ted,
yeah, sorry, go
is
ahead.
yeah, one thing I've learned about you is that you really pay a lot of attention to how people learn. I mean, you do a lot of training, and
Yeah.
you really follow the research on this. But yeah,
Yeah, I was gonna say it's like it's a passion because like you said, like I do a lot of training and just there's so much that we have wrong about how people learn and how to teach, and there's some stuff that drives me crazy. So
although this does get back to what we had mentioned last week about psychological research is difficult to reproduce. So you have to take it all with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and the theories are just that. They're theories. They're not like this is definitively how things work. But certainly there are some things that education is usually much better. Some of the studies are often pretty well controlled. Not a lot of great studies, but there are some good ones. But there are some that seem to hold up very well. And the examples versus abstractions and so on. There's a larger thing that's like how do you structure, like if I'm teaching something, how do you structure that? And so that gets into a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yeah. Anyway, Astrid says go coding already. So let's go ahead and go code. So what we're doing here is we implemented fetch, and we've confirmed that it works the way we think it should, including learning a few things about the way the Node version implementation of fetch doesn't work. Yeah.
The keep alive, yeah.
So I think what we are ready to do now is we want to start turning this into the form that we want from our production code. Like we've been operating entirely out of the test class up until this point. And so what we want to do is actually make an HTTP client class. And the way that works, I love doing this, is we'll turn it into the form we want, and then we'll just move it over.
Right.
But I don't think we're in that form yet. So I think that's what we should do, is we should talk about, well, how do we want the API to present itself? And then we can factor out in this class what that fetch API looks like.
So we've got so it's already in the form of a post. So we said, what's the interaction going to be here? Well,
I think
what was our? I even forgot what our endpoint was.
Well, let me go ahead and bring up the README again.
Yeah.
What we're doing is we want to be able to send a prompt to OpenAI from the front end. That's our overall goal. And we're going to have an application class on the front end that talks to a front end wrapper, some sort of back end client, which uses an HTTP client to make the request, and then we'll have a back end post endpoint and so forth.
Okay.
Now, I think we're pretty much in agreement that that's going to be a post request, and it's going to be a JSON payload and a JSON payload back. However, I don't think our HTTP client should have that coded into it. What I found is that making my low-level wrappers, so there's high-level wrappers and low-level wrappers. High-level wrappers are specific to the service we're talking to, and low-level wrappers are really about the protocol, in this case, HTTP. What I found is that the more specific I make those low-level wrappers, the more difficult I make it to debug the high-level wrapper. Like, I really want the low-level wrapper to just be a dumb pipe. And so the decisions about, is it post, is it JSON, or whatever, I want that to be encoded in the high-level wrapper, so that when we say, how do we talk to the back end, we don't have to look at HTTP client. We just look at the back end client and say, oh yeah, well, here's a post, here we see it converting to JSON, and so forth.
Yeah. It's really interesting because the way you describe that, it sounds like, this would also make the HTTP client more reusable. And that's not, at least it doesn't sound like that's really the primary reason. The primary reason is let it do its job, but push the stuff that really is higher level, I guess, is one way to look at it, for troubleshooting or for just exploring.
I think it's one of those serendipitous things that happens with good design, and it's that, yes, it does make it reusable, but when I start from the perspective I want to make this reusable, I usually end up with a
Right.
disaster.
Well, that's the premature abstraction problem right there.
Yeah.
Is I don't know what would this second version of it need from this underlying thing. I don't know, but yeah, sort of good design. In this case, it's almost a layer kind of way of approaching it. That this one's only responsible for just, you know, sending out this stuff, but this one is responsible for well, how do I interpret this text that came back? Is it just text or is it JSON and things like that? Yeah.
It's really the decision being made here is, again, it's one of the primary things I think about in design is, what are each of my classes responsible for?
Yeah.
And how can I keep those responsibilities nicely segregated and not overlapping?
Yeah.
And so the decision about, I mean, this is sort of a carrier. It's not aware of what it's carrying. It's just carrying data.
Right.
And anytime, if we put anything in here that makes judgments about what it's carrying, now we have moved some of those responsibilities out of our backend client.
Right.
So, and the reason I bring that up is because we did start to assume that it was going to be JSON.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to pull that back out, I think. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to factor out body into a variable called body. Now, why isn't it letting me factor out body?
Because you need the paren. There we
go. There we go. And let's make that a shorthand. I think the method we also want to pull out.
Yes.
And then I'll
make that shorthand property.
And the headers we'll want to pull out.
And there might end up being some content agnostic headers, but certainly the application JSON, clearly if we're pulling out the JSON, that goes with it. Yeah.
And we've got some naming issues that we'll work out later.
Well, IntelliJ loves to add one to everything.
Yeah. Well, in this case, it was doing the right thing because we already have a headers variable down here. Yeah. So this is really the response headers. And this is the request headers, which I'm just going to call headers.
And then, yep.
Okay.
Yes, Ouija, I've seen it add 2 and you already have a 1. Like, no, now you're just making it worse. They're not conflicting. Okay. Usually 2, if it's gone to 2, there definitely is a conflict. 1 is just like, I can't guess. Yeah.
I think this is our fetch right here. Methods, header, body. The delete, I think we want to, we don't want to have that as part of our...
No, I think we were just doing that mainly to make the tests a bit easier. But that shouldn't be part of fetch. Sure, and certainly shouldn't be deleting the deleting headers.
Yeah. So maybe that should come down here.
Yeah.
So I think this right here is our fetch code.
Well, here on 55, it's converting. It's assuming a JSON response. So we probably want to.
Yeah, and also hold that thought because also
and we hard coded the URL
too. So we're going to want the URL to be there. Headers, yeah, and then so fetch response.json. Part of the reason we use that is because it was a simplified view of the body.
Right.
We're going to need a way of pulling the body back as text. So let's go ahead and look up on MDN or the fetch API again. Response. So there's response body.
That's for creating a response, but if we get a response...
Where do we see...
I thought I saw extract text or something.
It's the result of fetch. Oh, you know what? I don't think this is actually the right. This is the actual API documentation on it. Options, blah, blah, blah. Where's our return value type? Promise that resolves to a response object. Response.body is a readable stream. Blob representation, so we might want to look at that.
I think we want just .text.
Just .text. Yeah, I think you're right. Let's take a look at what blob is doing.
I assume blob.
Yeah, I think just text is what we want.
As if we were getting. It probably doesn't do character encoding and all that kind of fun stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think.
I mean, this is so. This is interesting. This is now making a decision at this layer that we're assuming text.
Yeah, and this is a case where if we want it to be reusable, we might go for blob.
Right.
But I don't care about reusability.
Right.
I care about separation of responsibilities.
Yeah.
And I think this is something I'm okay with.
Because the alternative is we return the promise and say it's totally up to you to figure it out. And that's.
But then our abstractions leak in.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah. This is going to be just body.
Right.
And we're going to expect our body to be, well, something. This is probably going to fail.
Yeah, we probably need to stringify that, right?
It's going to be.
I assume it's not going to automatically stringify that, what we wrote as JSON.
No, we need to do JSON.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yep.
And now actually we don't even have to do JSON here because.
That's true.
And that might make our test a little bit simpler if we say that call this request body and just say my request body.
Mm-hmm.
And down here we can say
then that's just a string. Yep.
My request body. Okay, didn't work. We are still getting the JSONified version. Oh, that's because
we set the response.
That was we looked at the wrong thing.
Yes.
So my response body. And under last request, body here should be my request body.
Right. You got an extra close paren there, yeah.
And our content length has changed.
Right, because it's no longer JSON, it's now text.
There we go.
All right.
Okay. So I think we've now pulled out everything that's not the shape we want it to be. Am I right on that?
That looks good, yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to call this fetch options.
Mm-hmm.
Pull this out into a function called request async. My naming convention, we can change this if you like, but my naming convention in JavaScript is anything that returns a promise ends in the word async.
Oh, that's great. I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
Since
And
there's
any
no,
variable that contains a promise is called blah, blah, blah promise.
right.
Because
Because,
it's just really easy to get wrong.
yeah. No, it's totally helps me because otherwise there's no other way to know what it is.
Yeah. I mean, in TypeScript, because it is typed, it will be typed to return a promise. So things are a little bit better in TypeScript. But I mostly use JavaScript. So it's just nice to see, if I see an async, my brain's always looking for the await. Okay, so it's passing in the method, headers, body, request body, and URL. I think I want that to be...
I think the URL should be earlier.
Yeah, let's see. I think the URL should be first. Then method, the headers, and body. That's the way I usually think about it.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Okay. And then because the headers and body, at least, I think are optional.
I was just about to say, what do we do about optional? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm going to wrap this whole thing in an object. I guess maybe we should put it on one line.
Does it let you refactor that to what's basically a parameter object?
That's a good question.
Because in Java it does. You say introduce parameter. I don't know.
Honestly, I think the easy way to do this is to just do it that way. And it is not happy with these type declarations. I'm going to take them out for now. We'll come in and do the TypeScript stuff later. There we go.
Hmm.
And then I think I'd like this to be body, not request body.
Right, because now that's redundant given the context that it's in a method called request. Yeah.
Exactly. Except that didn't work properly.
Content length 0.
Yeah, we lost our body.
Oops. So
that's because
we didn't name it. Yeah. So in our
right there, it needs to be a body. This we can probably just call body now as well. There. Okay.
So Sweegie says something about you need the type after the object. I don't know.
Sweegie's right. I sort of short-circuited that by taking the types out entirely, but one of the quirks of TypeScript is that when you have an object, the types go after the object, and it's just for compatibility. It's sort of an ugly syntax for compatibility with JavaScript.
That's interesting.
We'll come back to that when we do the types.
Yeah.
Can you make a note if you're keeping a to-do for us, can you make a note that we need to add optional headers and body? I don't want to do it yet because I want to put a test around it.
Yeah.
If we're going to do that.
Okay, noted.
Okay. Put these on multiple lines, but I actually think that we're now ready to inline all of these things.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now we're getting...
I don't know that we need to pass the content type of application JSON anymore.
Well, I mean, the test doesn't care.
Right.
And it's not JSON anyway, so...
Exactly. Let's see. That was last request. That should have worked. Why did it not work?
Are we asserting on it? Oh, there's a
If we
default
don't provide a
content type,
content type, it gives us a default.
which is the appropriate content type.
Yeah, I think I'm going to just document that. Like, this is what it does when you do nothing else.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So then I think the only other weird thing here is this: we're returning response headers as opposed to. I think that's just because here we're saying response headers,
Right.
and so the automatic. Yeah, so
Yeah.
we can get rid of the response headers now. And then can I change this to not return an object?
What is it? It's not inline. What does inline do in that case?
Inline what I think would inline the request async method.
Oh.
I'm gonna, let's change signature, return type. Again, I think I don't trust it. I'm just gonna do it. There we go.
I think the safe delete on it might have done it because you just deleted it, but it knew that the response headers wasn't used.
Well, it would have deleted it, but it wouldn't have changed it from returning an object to returning just the one thing.
Okay. That's too bad.
Okay. I'm going to try inlining this response headers. Is that better or worse?
What was it before? Yeah, I think I think that's fine.
And here's one more thing.
I think
I don't like that.
I think that's fine too. I don't have a strong feeling for that. I mean, it's.
I think I'm going to do it this way. Make it real clear what which ones are the fetch options.
Mm-hmm.
And there's our fetch, and there's our fetch, and then we return.
Okay.
I think that's it. I think we've factored out our fetch. I think the next thing to do is to move it into an HttpClient class. But I think I might check in first.
That's a good idea.
So what we've done here is we factor out request async.
Yep.
Stop me anytime you want to drive, by the way. But I'm just going to go ahead and make an HttpClient here.
So is this a refactor move, or are you just going to cut and paste?
I'm going to try to move it, but I'm not sure if it's going to work.
I think you have to give it the destination.
Isn't that what I've done?
Yep. Hey, look at that.
Okay. Ooh, that did not work though.
Cannot find.
Oh, it wasn't smart enough. That's all right. This isn't what we want anyway. We want to export a class called HttpClient that has a method on it called request async.
And then we have to change our usage of it, or is it on?
Yeah, I'm going to back this up. It did not. Sad. All right, let's try this again. So what I want to do is, see, this is why I don't use the automated refactorings that much. It gets
That's a shame, because it's like a move like that shouldn't be that hard.
It shouldn't be that bad. Okay, so what we want is we want an HTTP client. We want the request async to be inside of HTTP client. And then what
I think you were I think you had, I don't know if the async mattered. Yeah. Isn't it HTTP underscore client.ts?
No.
Oh, okay.
Because we're cross-compiling it to JavaScript.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. And for whatever reason, the cross-compilers don't rename the .ts's to .js's. So
that's not confusing at all.
No, it's not. I mean, it's one of those things you just get used to.
I guess. But I don't want to get used to it. So there's the refactoring. That should work just as well. It didn't, but it should have. Cannot find HTTP client.js. Is it not compiling it?
It probably isn't compiling it because my watch script has a little bit of trouble with added files.
Which we've just done.
Which what?
Which we've just done.
Right.
Added
exactly.
files.
Like it doesn't. I'm using a old module called Gaze that doesn't seem to recognize added files.
Oh.
And the newer version of Node has file watching built in, but I've never updated. Like I wrote this way back in 2013 or something like that. So I've never updated it, and I just know, I've added a file, kill it and restart it.
Right.
Code's actually written to automatically kill and restart when you add a file, but it just doesn't detect that added files. One of these days I'll go through and I'll use the new version of Node. Okay, so now I should be able to inline this.
I was going to say that seems like the next step is to inline the caller. Cannot inline complex expression evaluation. That doesn't look complex.
We do it live. There. I don't know why it couldn't inline that. We haven't specified any types, and it might be getting confused by that.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that is it. I think we've successfully
have a client.
Factored out our HTTP client class. So now we have a production class.
Do we want to instantiate the client where it's being instantiated now, or instantiate it before?
I want to do a whole bunch of cleanup.
Okay.
But I think the first thing we need to do is start adding types.
Yes.
I'm going to say that we have
extracted HTTP client.
Extract HTTP client class. Then if we go back to our watch script, if I kill it and tell it to do a type check, it will now start doing type checking on our code.
And fail.
And it will fail. But you'll notice it takes a lot longer to do the type checking, which is why I don't do that by default.
A lot longer.
Well, it's like almost a second.
I know.
It would take a lot longer if we had more files. So now we've got to start. That's where Sweetie was mentioning start to come in.
Yeah. So John CVV, it's like that's to me like if like straightforward refactorings don't work, I'm lost. I'm just lost.
So URL is a string, method is a string, headers is
an array of string, or is it a map
of
string to string?
Did I get that right? Oh, I think it's capital R record. What am I getting wrong here?
It's not map. I have no idea. Totally out of my.
Like all my strings are.
Oh, the strings are not.
You know what it is?
Oh, syntax.
And then the body is a string.
Yeah.
Except all of this is going to be a promise.
Oh, now I get why the type is done this way, because this is we're sort of implicitly creating a type right here.
Yeah.
It wasn't method parameters, it was a new okay, that's why I was getting confused. Okay.
Oh, the promise is on the return value. You're right, Suiji. So then we're going to say it returns a promise of type
status headers bodies, yeah.
Which should be a number, I think. And headers, which should be a record of string.
Mm-hmm. Body is also
and body,
a
which
string.
Should be a string. Okay.
Close.
Well, this one's working.
Yeah.
And then now over here, server is going to be
server
SpyServer, but yeah.
SpyServer, yeah.
Before all, blah, 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 blah.
So F2 jumps to your next error.
Okay, our last request is what is last request? Path, method, headers, and body. I think we're going to want to actually pull that out as a type.
I was going to say, at what point do we create an actual type?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think this is the SpyServer request. And what do we say goes in here?
I don't remember.
It was path, method, headers.
So it doesn't have an extract interface?
It might.
No idea if that'll work. Where to put it?
Nope.
Oh well.
Yep. It's a nice idea. What's this complaining about?
Because now it implements the SpyServer requests. So I think it was working at a different level than we thought it was.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. So last request is going to be a SpyServer request, and this is going to be a SpyServer response. Yeah, if we had programmed it here, like blah blah blah,
right,
then we could have done extract interface. It would have worked fine. I think this is complaining because it doesn't know that. It's weird that my errors are not working properly.
It says property has no initializer and is not definitively assigned in the constructor. So in the status bar.
So it doesn't know that we're calling this dot request here.
Right.
But I can just tell it that we are.
Yeah.
With an exclamation mark. And this dot last request. Oh, we do have to say that this is going to be either
Oh, so we can assign it null. Yeah.
Yeah. A null or a SPY request. Oh, so in that case, we might just do it that way.
But it's still not assignable.
Yeah. This is complaining because we aren't telling it that the promise is a void type. Complaining because
that doesn't have a type.
Yeah. So this is going to be an HTTP request.
I don't. What type is that?
So it's whatever type comes with Node,
Oh.
and I'm not sure how to find that information.
Yeah, this is where somebody supplies the TypeScript. I forget what they call them for.
Definitively typed is the packages.
Yeah.
And we have those installed. It's just we need to get there from here. And I've done it before. I just thought that usually saying go to reference should do the trick. There we go. So we were saying create server.
Ah.
So it looks like we want an incoming message and a server response. Good night, Astrid. Thanks for joining us.
Have a good night, Astrid.
So what did I say? This was an incoming
message. Yeah.
This was a server response. And I have to import that and import that. Okay. And the chunk, I think it just knows what's going on there based on the rest of this stuff. And then what is this complaining about?
Because it could be undefined, I guess. Really? It could be undefined?
Yeah, that's what's... So I guess incoming message...
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
It's defined as being potentially undefined.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what we just do here...
Do we be compatible?
We'll just... optional. Because there's no harm for us if they're undefined.
Yeah.
And this is supposed to be...
Oh, it should be a string array. Either a string or a string array.
Yeah.
What did we have? Really? It's a string or a string array?
Yeah, this... I've run into this before. The node headers are weird. I think, yeah, I'll just do that. String or string array.
Oh, for the value of the record, I was thinking it was saying that the whole headers was a string array. No, that totally makes sense because you could have multiple header values, but
when you really dig into it, it gets kind of wonky. Like the default way Node handles headers is got some funky stuff in it. They've actually changed it. It's doing a little bit of processing on it. So like cookies, they won't put it in an array. They will just put it all in one string.
Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, incoming HTTP headers is the type. Let's just call it an incoming HTTP headers.
Oh, there's already a type. Okay. So do we need the question mark on the headers?
Let's try taking all the question marks off and see which ones complain. Path and method you're complaining.
Okay. Well, sure. I can totally see that.
Okay. And
So
now this one's
value,
complaining.
because it doesn't know that it's a string?
Okay, so here's where we're coming into problems. Oh no, we don't have a server. Yeah, we don't know what SpyServer response is yet.
Oh, all right. We didn't define it.
SpyServer response is, what is it? Status, headers, and body. So status is going to be a number.
Right.
And headers is going to be, for us, it's just going to be a string of strings. We're not going to do anything fancy with it.
Right.
The body is going to be a string.
Right. So that's the same thing as the last request was not definitively assigned.
Yeah. It just occurred to me that we truly aren't definitively resigning it. So I'll do that there and then say that we're assigning it there. Okay, getting close now.
Yeah.
Only 4 errors.
So it's still that can't find the node module. And Suiji had mentioned something about...
Yeah, and he submitted, Suiji submitted a pull request, which I did incorporate. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. But here, the issue is just that we're not saying that the promise is void.
Ah, okay.
So I believe...
That looks like it, other than that.
Okay, so there's a way... yeah, so what it's complaining about now is it's not...
No, it doesn't like chunk either.
Okay.
IntelliJ was fine with it, but...
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, let's go fix that first. The chunk here is going to be...
Is it an any? Is it truly
It's not an any. It's either a string or a buffer. It might just be a buffer, but let me look at the documentation. For the data event. I think it's a buffer. And it's just getting converted to a string when we add it to our string. So we'll call that a buffer. Could have sworn I installed the type definitions for Node.
Yeah, I thought I saw it in the...
The script should have run npm install for us, but just in case.
Yeah.
Oh, are they installed in the build script?
That's
probably what
I was
it
going to
is.
say, don't we have these things in two places?
Yeah, we do. And honestly, I don't think the types need to be installed in the front end. I think they only need to be installed in the build script because it's the build that's doing the work.
So wouldn't IntelliJ want them in the front end?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's right.
Yeah.
We need them in the front end to make the IntelliJ happy, and we need them in the build to make the build happy.
Right.
We could just have one node modules at the top level, but the reason I did two was because the build's got all kinds of modules it depends on that I don't want to accidentally end up in a front end deployment.
Right.
So let's see what we've got in our front end. Yep, we don't have any types in our front end.
Right.
Okay. Now it's giving us 17 errors. Oh, did I stash it? I did.
Yep, back to 3.
Okay.
Is that the right version?
It's the latest version.
Oh, okay.
Because I didn't specify a version, so it would just be the latest one.
Okay. Thought we were using 18 for some reason.
Oh. I don't know that the definitively typed version matches the Node version.
Okay.
I'd be wrong about that. Yeah, we don't even have a Node 20 yet.
Oh, so okay. Yeah, version.
I guess we do.
Yeah.
But
18 is the LTS.
They're backwards compatible, so
okay.
Even if it does matter, it should be fine. So what have I done? Install types. Install types for Node. I messed up the JSON file.
JSON does not like an extra comma.
I hate it.
Which is hilarious because JavaScript from which it's extracted does.
Yeah.
But it might predate it or something.
Yeah. And Douglas Crockford, who made JSON, notoriously opinionated.
Yes.
So it's still not working. I hate this kind of stuff. Like, I don't mind debugging code that I wrote.
Right.
But debugging these sorts of things drives me batty. Cannot find module node HTTP or its corresponding type declarations. Oh, it's no longer. Oh, there it is. Did you install
Yeah.
types/node? I think I'm going to check this in before I get too much further. And I think I'm going to add. The reason I'm thinking that we should check in is because we've got the types working. We spent some time on that.
Yeah.
And then now we've got to
And I got to fix some
futz
configuration
around
stuff.
with
Yeah.
the rest of it. So types and types. Still doesn't like them yet. So, I mean, the first thing I can think of is let's move node modules to the top level. Instead of having two separate node modules, let's just combine them together at the top level.
Yeah, I can try that.
See if that makes a difference. Or maybe if I copy it to the top level.
And then you'd want to run the npm install, yeah. Well, that's interesting. That's different.
That's super weird. Let me try.
Is that from node? Is the node : HTTP the correct way to specify the module?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
It's a URL, technically. Node's the protocol.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
Yeah. You can also just say, I mean, let's try taking that out, but it may have to do with the fact that we're doing it twice.
Well, that's what I was wondering, because we did it from HTTP. That seemed to work. The node. And now it's definitely duplicated.
Yeah.
And now it's not defined.
Now it's not defined. So HTTP dot. See. Also, IntelliJ is super confused.
Well, there is an HTTP 2, which is the HTTP/2 protocol support.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Add
I don't.
ES module interrupt true to TS config. Thing is I have made this work before, using the exact TS config I have now. Like when I set this up, I copied the TS config I had from a working system.
Right.
Sweetie, would you mind looking up, or Ted, somebody, can you look up how do we import named things and defaults in the same import statement? I just don't remember how to do it.
Yeah, I must have found the same Stack Overflow question.
Well, let me try it. tsconfig and es module interop. Oh, that's not right. I hope that's not right. Yeah, first we just have to tell it. I'll come back to this one. First, we just have to tell it that we're importing all these types and we're importing.
Yes, I don't understand. What is?
We want to import the default export from HTTP,
Okay.
Which is HTTP. And we want to import all these named types from HTTP.
So import.
Okay, that did it. Import star as HTTP from HTTP. Did the trick.
So what? So okay.
So what's happening here is Node's HTTP module is exporting all these functions,
Okay.
including create server, which is the one we're using.
Okay.
And normally the way you do that is you just say require.
Right.
But if I can make this that's funny. It used to have an option to show you the
To show you the non-require version.
Yeah. Maybe I need to look at the current version of the documentation. Huh. I guess they took that out. Anyway, so it's got all these functions in there, which are normally just you get by just saying, give me everything you've got.
Right. Right.
And I thought that was the default export, but maybe I was mistaken on that. The fact that the code was working seems to say that it was the default export, but I don't know. So what we were doing was we were just mucking around with the import statement to get it to match.
Yeah.
And now that we've done that, using the correctly specified version, like this works, but this is more correct because this way you can't accidentally get some third party typo squatting type of deal. So I'm just going to amend the existing. What do we do? Yeah, I'm just going to amend our commit here.
Right. So then HTTP becomes the prefix for those to tell it where to look for it. Okay.
Yeah. What makes this awkward is that Node doesn't have built-in types. It's not TypeScript aware.
Yeah.
So we've imported this additional package called definitively typed at type/node.
Right.
And the way it interacts with node.h:/HTTP is not something I fully understand. So down here, when we're specifying the types, yeah, we have to say HTTP dot. Now, to make this all even more confusing, I don't remember having to do it this way last time I tried this.
Right.
Also, I like moved the package JSON around, so I'm going to undo all of that and rebuild and see if it still works. It doesn't work.
That looks like because of the server.
Yeah. That's just leaving something running.
Yeah.
Try it again.
It's such a common mistake, and I I warn people about it all the time, and then I make it myself. Is no, read the error message.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's so easy, like you're in a flow, and it's easy to say, "Oh, I know what that is. That was just the same thing." It's like, "Oh, actually, it's something completely different."
So something else that's wonky is that it is having trouble finding the type declaration if I don't declare it at the top level and have it installed at the top level. So let's take our break.
Yeah.
And then we'll take a look at that when we come back. I might try to take that one on offline because it doesn't seem like a good use of our time.
Yeah. All right, folks, let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll see what we'll do next. All right, and we're back, folks.
Okay, so I'm going to make a note to follow up on this this type error because I don't think it's going to be very interesting to figure it out. So figure out why type checking doesn't work.
So we did that.
But we can work around it by just having the top level package.json. So I'm going to put, oh, and there it is. I just do an npm install. That should make it work.
All right.
So that's our workaround.
Yeah, that's an okay workaround.
Let me. Oops. Okay. All right. So we've got our HTTP client. I think what's next is to clean up our tests.
Yeah.
So what I was thinking here is I'm okay with the SpyServer as it is. I was thinking that we would split this apart into a makes HTTP requests and returns HTTP response, just to simplify the test a little bit.
Okay.
Should I drive and do that?
Yeah. Did we want to do? Shoot, I forgot what I was going to say. Oh well, it literally just leapt out of my mind as I was talking.
It'll come back to you. Did it have to do with the types?
No. All right, never mind. It'll come to me.
It'll come back to you. Yeah. So if we're going to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just clone the test. And we'll have the first one be make requests, in case we don't care about the response. We're still going to need the client. Still going to need to make the request. We don't care about the response. So we're just going to assert that the last request we got from the server matched
was what we
all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't need to worry about this here.
Right.
And I'm just going to add a note here that fetch adds a bunch of headers that we don't explicitly define.
Do you want to group those together? Because you've got the keep alive, and then our custom one, and then the content type.
Let's see. This is our custom one.
Yeah.
The rest is all what it defines, isn't it?
Yes. Although, yeah. So I was getting I was getting a little lost in the because there's no indentation for like oh, never mind. No, I'm getting lost because some are quoted and some are not quoted. That's why I was getting lost.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they could all be quoted.
Yeah.
And that might be a little easier to read. I think if we do that, the linter might complain. Nope, it's fine with that.
Oh, why would the linter complain? Because you could unquote it?
I tend to be pretty strict on my linting because it's easier to relax than to make it more strict.
Sure.
And so there's probably a linting setting somewhere that says complain if you quote something that doesn't have to be quoted.
I see.
And I thought it might be set, but it's not, so it doesn't matter. We are getting a timeout, though.
Oh, when did that happen?
I think it might be happening because we have 2 tests now. Yeah, I don't know when it happened. Let me back things up and see.
Better not, because we quoted those strings.
It wasn't. It's because we didn't set the response.
We didn't set the response. Oh, yeah. So just blocked on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it's blocking on exactly. Because we should be, yeah. So if we take out set response, it fails.
That seems bad.
It does seem bad, yeah.
We might want to fix that.
Oh, I don't know. I thought we'd, just call it a day. We're calling set response inside of our reset.
Did we not?
And reset is being called on before each.
Okay, so it is called before each.
So it should be fine.
So if we don't set a response, what does the code do?
We're definitely setting a response.
But we're setting it with an empty body by default. But it's an empty body, not a null.
Yeah, it's an empty body. So there's something about...
Ooh.
So, oops, I've lost our... What's the word? There's something about either the headers or the body that's causing this to be a problem.
Oh, I saw the connection close in the response.
Oh, it's the connection close.
Yeah. So can we have that as, is that, but that's for testing only.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think we should modify our server to keep track of all the connections and kill them that way. It's not that hard. What we can do is we can keep a list of connections, which we will make as a, I'm not sure what type that will be, so I'll leave that off for now.
Do you want to give it?
We'll start it out as an array.
Okay.
And then in our server, we get a connection. We're going to get, I think, a socket. I have not done this before, at least not for a very long time. So let's see.
Hey, Tukes, in terms of your question about, so Ruby has Hotwire, .NET has Blazor, what about Java? I don't know that there's anything that's going to be sort of standardized or has become a standard. There is some stuff going on with Timeleaf and HTMX, but it remains to be seen how widespread that gets. So these socket objects.
Yeah, Ruby sockets.
Yeah. Push, yeah. And now, because it's not typed, we now know what type it should be.
Yeah, so we can add that here. That's going to be net.socket. Okay. Oh, I think I have to do it.
Oh, because we haven't queried it yet. Yep, that's fine.
Yeah. Then here in stop, what we're going to do is we'll close the server. Then we will loop through the connections.
Oh, and explicitly close each connection. That doesn't.
Not end. Let's see what sockets do.
So it closes the event. So I thought I saw dot close. When did I?
I think it may be destroy that we want, actually.
Oh.
Destroy. There we go. There's also end, but I think destroy is what we want. Boom. Yeah.
Just sounds more not good. I don't know what the word might
Much
be.
more final.
Yeah, much more like destructive than I would have thought.
Yep, that did the trick. So now we don't need to do close anymore.
Yay.
I think I might want to check that in.
Yeah, let's do that.
What do we do? SpyServer destroys open sockets with extreme prejudice.
So do we want to keep the skip since that test? So one of the tests. So you got a dot skip on one of the tests. Is that okay?
Yeah, because we're kind of in the middle of
that's what I thought.
working on the tests.
Yeah.
Because the way I do integration, where I commit, and then we integrate.
Right.
It's not until you get to the integrated commit that I want everything to be back together. Some people use Squash to sort of hide these sort of interim commits, but I think it's valuable to have it. So I use a merge commit instead.
But we actually don't know that the test passed because it was skipped. When we ran them.
This one works.
Yeah.
And this one is a work in progress.
Oh, okay.
It is in fact not working because...
But it fails for that reason as opposed to timeout.
Yeah. But now this one says we make the HTTP requests. We don't need to set the response anymore.
Right.
We're just going to make the request, and then we're going to assert on the response.
Right. Well,
and then here...
assert on the last request, yeah.
Then here we can say it receives HTTP response.
Right.
And we'll set the response, do the client. We don't actually care about anything. And then we get the response back. Might as well keep the response content length, but I don't think we care about the date.
Yeah.
Because figuring out that date would be a real hassle. And then the last request we don't care about because we already tested that.
And we don't need the connection closed, do we?
Don't.
That's the response.
So we expected headers of my response header. We got...
Oh, because we still have it as an object, yeah. That's interesting that default timeout is 5.
Yeah, remember how it was 5 seconds?
Yeah, that's where it comes from.
Okay, it's still complaining.
Because the order is different?
That doesn't matter.
Oh, 16 is not a number. It's a string. That's bizarre.
There we go. Then we've got a console log hanging out somewhere. No, because headers are strings of strings. So of course it's a string.
Oh, yes. Okay, right. At our level, yes, that's true. Right.
Okay. I think that's our tests. I think I'll check this in too.
Yeah.
Split HttpClient tests.
Separate. Yep.
And then Normally what I do at this point is I would factor out a helper method for the request.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking that almost like the assertion is also kind of noisy with the default server headers. I don't know if you'd refactor that out, but especially that one.
If it was higher level, I would, but I think here it's actually relevant. Like if I'm coming along and saying, how does the HTTP request work?
Okay, that's fair.
I want to see this documented that we've got all these things.
Okay.
Before we factor it out, though, I do want to add one more test. And that is that I want to say that it provides or it fills in default headers and body are optional.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because that was something we wanted to add.
And now that we're duplicating this, I think actually we might want to factor out all these defaults. So yeah. Because we do have to have all these in here again that we don't care about.
What doesn't it like about the... Oh.
Okay, so now I think the issue is just that we don't have our defaults defined. We want our headers to default to empty and our body to default to empty. And then this optional. Length is going to be 0.
Okay.
And then to your point, we can factor this out into standard fetch request headers.
Yep.
Or default fetch request headers.
Yeah. That spread operator comes in handy here.
I love that spread operator so much. And the other thing I really love is the destructuring, object destructuring.
Yeah.
Where we can come in and say, well, like here.
Yep. Yeah, Java eventually will be getting some of that.
JavaScript started out as a really terrible language.
Yeah.
Like truly terrible. And
and
it's so ubiquitous.
Yeah, and they copied all the bad stuff from Java.
Yeah. And introduced some truly, nasty stuff of its own around the ways of how type conversion works. Like it's just, and then of course having null and undefined. There's some really weird decisions in early JavaScript, which a lot are excused by the fact that it was literally defined and created in 1 week.
Yeah.
But one thing I love about it is that it's got a very active language committee that is constantly like improving the language, often with an emphasis on developer experience. So like all these type definitions that we're putting in here, there is actually something going through the standard process to add type definitions to the language.
Right.
Not not having it do anything, but just having it automatically be stripped so that now you don't have to do cross compilation, so that this would be legal JavaScript. Because, I mean, as you were noticing earlier, this is weird that we're not actually importing the thing that we're importing.
Right.
Since we've got, so this could now be.
Yeah. That one can be the default.
Which is what?
Default
fetch request headers. And then do we want to do the same thing now that we've got it for the request? Do we want to do the same thing for the default server headers?
That feels less compelling because there's only 3 of them.
2 really, because content length is not.
2 of them, right? Yeah. So.
Yeah. I part of me wants to do it just for consistency because we already got the default request.
I mean, it is interesting that those 2 headers are specifically keep alive. So maybe I would not. Yeah. I would not object.
It's not really because of fetch. So it wouldn't be default fetch request headers. It would be like default server response headers. Your call.
I say leave it.
Okay. So we've tested that the header and body are optional.
Mm-hmm.
And then I do kind of want to pull this out into a.
I agree that pulling that out into a
helper method.
Into a helper method would make sense.
Yeah. And this is something I do all the time in JavaScript because it's so easy. Sorry, that's not the one I'm going to pull out though. I'm going to take this. It's really the path that we want.
And
the method. And here's body. We'll pull this down. And where did that end up? Here it is.
Nice.
Not actually the format I want for it. I want it to be an object, and I don't see a refactoring for that.
Yeah, because in Java it would say introduce parameter object, but I don't.
Yeah,
I don't see that here.
I don't usually do this with TypeScript. Usually, without TypeScript, it's just put the braces around it, then you're done.
Yeah.
With TypeScript, it's a little bit uglier.
Now here you're defining my header. The key was to actually define. Oh, because is that the default?
Sorry, let me fix this up real quick, and then I'll look at what you're talking about.
So there on line 20, it says headers my header : string.
Oh, that's just something weird about the way the refactoring happened.
Yeah.
That should just be a record of
right.
String to string. And I want this to be on multiple lines, but I'm not seeing a way to do it, so. The headers will default. Actually, the headers we won't default to anything. The path we should default to irrelevant path. Method will default to thing. Maybe trace.
Trace, yeah. Options.
Something. Oh yeah, options is a good one. And this I'll default to undefined. The reason is I want to be able to have it work like that. Now we can call request async without any parameters.
Got it.
For those cases where it matters.
Right.
Specifically, it's going to matter here, where we don't actually care about what any of the parameters are.
Mm-hmm. Still expects one argument.
Might specify those as undefined just to make it more obvious.
Uh-oh.
Fetch failed. The other ones worked.
Is the fetch going to work without a local host? Or did the local host get put inside?
The local host is part of request async up here.
Okay, it is. So the path is irrelevant. Maybe it didn't like the options. Actually, I'm confused with what's failing now.
Yeah, I'm a little confused too. Oh, you know what? We do need to specify the path and the method because we're
asserting against it. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is failing because we've got URL here instead of path.
And a slash is being added for us in the. I think that might be confusing.
I think that's an error.
Did we do that everywhere?
We did not.
So somewhere there's a my path without a slash there.
Okay, there we go.
All right.
All right. So now we should be able to bring this all back in. And I really wish there was a quick key to do this reformatting for me.
So what's interesting is you did this refactoring backwards from the way I usually do it, which is you introduce the variables first, then extracted the method, and then you inline the variables. I do it the other way. I extract the method and then push out using introduce parameter.
And I think that's partly just familiarity, but also keep in mind a lot of what I'm familiar with IntelliJ is not trusting its refactorings in JavaScript.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, it's like, and I'm not sure if that works well with JavaScript or TypeScript. Yeah. So, totally.
And part of the reason you do it the way you do it is because it automatically detects like the similar shapes and will factor them all up for you.
Yes.
Whereas I don't think it's smart enough to do that even with TypeScript.
Yeah.
Like here, I have to come through and manually change this.
That should be path. Yep. Learn that lesson. But you don't need the local host.
It is complaining because we never returned the response.
Whoops.
I deleted an await. There we go.
I saw you do that, and I'm like, wait, didn't they request async already have it? But no, the async in part of the name was supposed to indicate that you should call await.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, I think that's everything. I think we've cleaned this up. There's one more thing that I tend to do well, first I'm going to put this down at the bottom.
Right.
That's where I put my helper methods.
Yep.
And then there is one other thing I do, because these things change over time. I'm going to return it as an object, so that it's just sort of a standard way I do this, because often my helpers are going to return multiple things in JavaScript. And so I just have them all return.
Right.
That just prevents me from having to go through, because again, there's no simple refactoring on it.
Right.
So if I do it from the beginning, it doesn't slow down the test at all. And now I have the easy expandability in the future.
Right.
And I think that's it. I think we have cleaned up the test. Anything else that you see to add here? I'll let you skim through it if you want.
Yep. Looks good.
Yeah. I think I want to say here that we're explicitly making the headers undefined and the body undefined. All right. So that's our fetch wrapper. It's all done.
Yay. After a little bit of a unintentional detour into TypeScript.
Oh God.
Module stuff.
Yeah. So Sweegie says, are we going to nullabilize it next time? And I think that's what we need to do next. Is we need to make it nullable, because we want this HTTP client to be used from some sort of backend client, right?
Say that again. Sorry, I missed it.
So let's go to our README. So we're going to have this fetch wrapper HTTP client. It's going to be used by our backend client. In order for us to test the backend client,
right,
we don't want to have to set up another SpyServer.
Right. Yes.
So we'll make the HTTP client nullable. And so I think that's what we have to do next. And I think I might make that as a separate engineering task, make HTTP client nullable. All this one done. Yep. Normally, I think I would say let's integrate, except we've got this problem with the front-end packages not working properly. And I don't think we can integrate. And even if the integrate script works, I don't think we should, because it's not.
Because it's not quite.
It's not really reproducible yet.
Yeah.
Okay. Final thoughts?
Certainly a good stopping point. And again, this is one of those things where there's a bit of an investment up front to get this kind of thing working. But now once we have it, not necessarily because it's reusable, but now we can know that it's there and rely on it.
Yeah. It does make my heart sort of a little bit, because we could have just jumped straight to React.
Yeah.
We could have just called fetch. Like, the actual code to run fetch is pretty straightforward. Fetch is a good API. Do we really need this wrapper around it? It's a good enough API that our wrapper is virtually identical to its actual behavior. There's very little difference here. Headers is a little bit simpler, body is a little bit simpler. But do we really need this? I don't know. I see people jumping to just using this in their application level code all the time, and it always bites them.
Yeah, because what I don't see enough of is like, okay, but how are you going to test that? And I see some test stuff, and I'm like, that seems like a lot of work, or it seems too high level, or too end-to-end-ish. I'm like, but how are you going to sort of trace to what exactly is causing the problem? So, yeah.
Without this HTTP client, and without the backend client, and without making them nullable,
right?
The only way to test the application level code would be to actually spin up the backend and do end-to-end tests.
Right. Or set up, what I see a lot of is create a mock server, right? There are tools where it's like, hey, on your next response, return this JSON. I'm like, wow, that's a lot of work, not for the developer necessarily, but for like the computer to do. Like, you're spinning up a whole mock server to do work to return an unexpected response, when just do it inside of your process.
Well, and right, because they're making like a fake server,
an actual thing that is an actual server that's up and running.
But even if performance wasn't an issue, now in your application level code, you've got to be specifying what are the low level JSON return values from the service, and it's not encapsulated anymore.
Right.
Like, everything that touches that has got to know how that service works. And when you change, like we were talking about mouth clients, right? Or when you change from persona to auth0, because God knows you don't want to, but you end up having to do it anyway. Now you've got to rewrite every single freaking test that's got this low-level knowledge in it.
That separation of what's low level and what's high level. Separating those things, and you won't necessarily always get that separation right, but if you have none, then you'll definitely get it wrong.
So I hate having to write this, because I want to get to we want to do an RPG.
Yeah.
And so far we have done no RPG.
Yeah.
We barely even talked to OpenAI. But if we don't lay our foundations, we're not going to be able to. That's that curve that I talk about. Is you can start out fast and then get slower, or you can start a little bit slower and get faster.
So Rule 6 says, are you planning to test the UI components?
Yeah, we sure are. Actually, I have an example of that type of test right here. We're using Kent Dodd's testing library, as well as the JS DOM library, to allow us to simulate the browser DOM in the framework. Hey, Mobistar. And what that allows us to do is, as well as Kent Dodd's React testing library, so we can take a React component, we can render it into the DOM, pull it out, and make assertions on it. And I have not done a lot of that. I've done enough to have an example here for us to follow. But when we actually get to that, I think there'll be some learning to do. But we have the ability to click buttons on the interface and do all kinds of stuff. So I'm really looking forward to that when we get to it.
That'll be nice. Anything else?
No, I know we're stopping a little bit early today, but
hey,
I think this is a good spot.
Yeah, it's definitely a good spot.
Yeah, when it's over, it's over.
Yeah. All right, folks. Thanks a lot for hanging out, especially for all the great questions and conversation. And
yeah, especially at the beginning when we had all that stuff around event sourcing. That was really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and hopefully, RuleSec, you'll tune in for later ones and find us testing that stuff, because it's definitely not straightforward in the sense of not a lot of people do it the way I think we're going to be doing it.
Yeah,
that makes it harder to find.
Yeah, it'll probably be a couple more episodes before we get to the front end.
Yeah.
Like the UI stuff, we've got to finish out the HTTP. We got to make the HTTP client nullable, and then we have to make the backend client.
Yep.
That will probably be faster because we'll be using all the low-level stuff we've already written.
Right. Yeah.
And then once we have the backend client in place, then we can start using it in our UI.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, folks, and we'll see you next time for working on all that.
All right.
Have a great rest of your week.